1964. A journalist asked Dwight Eisenhower a simple question. Who was the greatest American soldier you ever knew? Most people guess Patton. Wrong. Some guess Marshall. Wrong again. Others guess Pershing, the most powerful American soldier since Grant, the man who commanded nearly 2 million troops in France. Not Pershing either. The journalist waited, and Eisenhower gave an answer that stopped the interview. In sheer ability and character, he said, he was the outstanding soldier of my time. The journalist looked up. The name Eisenhower had given was not in any newspaper, not in any newsreel, not in any documentary about D-Day or Normandy or the liberation of Europe. The journalist had to ask him to spell it. Foxconner. Here is the second thing you need to know about Fox Conner, and it is the one that makes the first thing stranger. He spent 20 years preparing America's greatest generals for a war he had predicted would come, and then he died without ever commanding a single battle in it. He watched from outside, retired, in declining health, too old for the war he had spent 2 decades building others to fight, as his students became the men the world would remember. He is not in the photographs from Normandy. He is not in the surrender ceremonies. He is not in the victory parades. He is mentioned in almost no documentary about the war he made possible. This is his story, and it is, in a very real sense, the origin story of every general you already know. Slate Springs, Mississippi, 1874. Fox Conner was the son of a Confederate officer who had been shot in the head at the Battle of Atlanta and blinded for the rest of his life. The man who would shape American generalship for 2 generations grew up watching his father navigate the world without sight, learning, without any formal lesson, something about finding different routes to accomplish what the obvious path could no longer reach. He graduated from West Point in 1898 and spent the next 2 decades in the unglamorous work of an officer who was intellectually serious in an institution that did not always reward intellectual seriousness. He went to France as an exchange officer with the French Army in 1911, an assignment that most officers would have considered a backwater, and that proved invaluable when America entered the First World War 6 years later, with almost nobody who understood how the French military actually functioned. In April 1917, when the United States entered the war, Fox Conner was an undistinguished major in one of the least prominent bureaus of the War Department. 19 months later, he was a brigadier general, sitting in the inner circle around Black Jack Pershing, the most powerful American soldier since Ulysses Grant. The speed of that rise tells you something about the man, but it doesn't tell you as much as what Pershing said about him when the war was over. I could have spared any other man in the AEF better than you. From John Pershing, a man not known for sentiment or excess, this was not a compliment. It was a precise, professional assessment. There were hundreds of generals in the American Expeditionary Forces. Pershing said he could have lost any single one of them before he lost Fox Conner. And then, with the victory won, and the accolades beginning to flow toward the men whose names would go in the history books, Fox Conner quietly stepped back and began the work that would take another 2 decades to complete. The interwar American Army was not a good place to think seriously about the next war. The nation had just fought the war to end all wars. Congress cut budgets. The public turned inward. Officers who had commanded divisions in France reverted to running companies and battalions in peacetime posts across a country that desperately wanted to believe military preparedness was somebody else's problem. Fox Conner did not share that belief. He had watched the Allied command structure in 1917 and 1918 produce repeated catastrophes through duplicated authority and the inability of French, British, and American commanders to establish a genuine shared chain of command. He had watched the German military be humiliated by a peace treaty designed to punish rather than stabilize. And he had drawn a conclusion that almost nobody in Washington wanted to hear. Another war was coming. Not maybe, not possibly. Written into the Treaty of Versailles, the way a storm is written into a weather pattern, not yet visible, but already determined. He was saying this privately, in conversations with junior officers he trusted. Nobody was publishing it. Nobody in power was listening. The country had spent the lives of over 100,000 men in Europe, and was not in the mood to consider doing so again. In 1920, one of those junior officers was in the worst professional trouble of his life. Major Dwight Eisenhower had returned from the First World War frustrated, stalled, and facing a formal reprimand that could have ended his career entirely. He had spent the war stateside training tank crews at Camp Meade, his repeated requests to deploy to France denied. After the armistice, he had done something that nearly cost him everything. He had publicly argued for a more aggressive, independent use of armored forces, positions that directly contradicted official Army doctrine. His commanding general warned him that if he continued, he would face a court-martial. Eisenhower was 29 years old. He had a wife, a young son, and a career going nowhere in an army that was shrinking and now actively hostile to his ideas. The colleagues he had expected to serve alongside were beginning to build reputations. He was being threatened with formal charges for thinking about warfare too seriously. Through a connection that began with George Patton, who had served with Connor in France and had been telling him about this young tanker who seemed worth watching, Fox Connor met Eisenhower at a dinner in 1920. He saw immediately what he had spent years looking for. In 1922, Connor arranged for Eisenhower to be transferred to his command in the Panama Canal Zone. Panama, 1922. A jungle posting that looked, from the outside, like a dead end. The kind of assignment the Army gave to officers who needed somewhere quiet to wait. What happened there, over the next 3 years, was one of the most consequential pieces of education in American military history, and it happened with almost no audience. Every night, 3 hours, 3 years, 1 student. After a long day's work, Connor and Eisenhower would read, not doctrine, not manuals, but the actual record of how wars had been fought and why they had ended. Biographies of Civil War generals, analyses of past campaigns, the history of high command and success and catastrophic failure. Their conversations continued after dinner, past midnight sometimes, the two of them talking through decisions made by men who were long dead in battles that had already been won or lost, because Connor believed the only way to understand future decisions was to wrestle honestly with past ones. He assigned Eisenhower Karl von Clausewitz's On War, once to read it, a second time to understand it, and then a third time. And each time through, Connor questioned him. Not, what did Clausewitz say, but what does it mean, and what does it require us to believe about war? He wanted Eisenhower to work with the argument until it had changed how he actually thought, not memorize the conclusion, but absorb the framework. One night, the sources don't give a precise date, only a place and a context, Connor handed Eisenhower the book for the 3rd time. Eisenhower asked why they were reading it again. Connor said something that Eisenhower would carry for the next 40 years. When the time comes, Connor told him, you will need to know this instinctively, not because someone hands it to you, because it's already in you. And then, in that same conversation, or in one very close to it, in that jungle, in Panama, in a period when most of official America believed the last war had ended all wars, Connor told Eisenhower something else. Another war was written into the Treaty of Versailles. It would come. Not in their lifetimes, perhaps, or perhaps exactly in their lifetimes, but it would come. And when it came, the officers who had spent these interwar years thinking carefully about what it would require would be the ones America needed. Eisenhower later said this was one of the most formative things he had ever heard a superior officer say. Not because it was new information. He could see, as any officer could, that the post-war settlement was unstable, but because Connor said it with the certainty of a man who had spent the last war in the planning rooms of the Allied High Command, who had watched the peacemaking happen, who understood the mechanisms of international relations not as abstractions, but as bureaucratic realities he had personally observed. He wasn't predicting, he was analyzing, and he expected Eisenhower to be ready. This is where the story could easily become a list of lessons learned, and where it has to stay human instead. Because what was happening to Eisenhower during those 3 years was not just intellectual. A man who had believed his career was finished, who had been told his ideas were unwelcome, his future limited, his trajectory already determined, was spending his evenings with an officer who treated him as though his potential was not only real, but urgent, who assigned him the hardest texts in military thought, and then argued with him about them for hours, who took him seriously, specifically and personally, at the moment when almost nobody else was willing to. Eisenhower later called Connor the one more or less invisible figure to whom I owe an incalculable debt. After Panama, Eisenhower went directly to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, the most competitive professional military education program in the American Army. He graduated first in his class of 245 officers. This was not a coincidence. Connor had spent 3 years building, in a man who was almost court-martialed for his ideas, the intellectual framework that could outperform an entire army. Here is the sentence this story requires you to sit with for a moment. If Fox Connor had not intervened in 1922, if he had not seen something in this frustrated young major and pulled him out of Camp Meade and taken him to Panama, there might never have been an Eisenhower. Not the Supreme Commander, not D-Day, not any of it. There would have been an officer named Eisenhower who faced a formal reprimand in 1922, and whose name does not appear in any history of the Second World War. Connor had not been building only one officer. During the First World War, he had worked alongside George C. Marshall, then serving as G3 of the 1st Infantry Division, and had formed a professional judgment about him that was unqualified. A man and a soldier of the very highest caliber. The relationship between them continued through the interwar years, shaped by the same intellectual seriousness that defined everything Connor invested in. Marshall would later maintain that he owed his greatest professional debts to what he had learned from Fox Connor. And Patton, brilliant, volatile, irreplaceable, had been close enough to the intellectual circles around Pershing and Connor during the First War that the influence, while less direct than Eisenhower's Panama experience, was documented and real. Connor had noticed Patton early. Patton had noticed Connor. 3 men, Eisenhower, Marshall, Patton, who together constituted something close to the command architecture of the entire American war effort in Europe, had all passed through the orbit of the man whose name the journalist, in 1964, had to ask to have spelled. The transmission of Connor's thinking into the Second World War operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Eisenhower built the Allied command structure in Europe around exactly the principles Connor had spent 3 years transmitting in Panama. Unified authority, the diplomatic subordination of national ego to shared operational objectives, the coalition management skill that kept Montgomery and Bradley and Patton inside a single chain of command through months of disagreement and crisis. Every time Eisenhower held that coalition together, and there were moments when it seemed very likely to come apart entirely, he was drawing on frameworks developed in late-night conversations in a jungle posting 2 decades earlier. Marshall rebuilt the American Army from almost nothing, using an understanding of officer quality, human judgment, and institutional design that their wartime working relationship had partly forged. The Weinberger Doctrine and the Powell Doctrine, 2 of the most consequential American strategic frameworks of the late 20th century, both carry the unmistakable DNA of Fox Connor's 3 principles. Never fight unless you have to. Never fight alone. Never fight for long. Robert Gates noted this connection explicitly in an essay on Connor published in Parameters, the Army War College's quarterly journal. The principles Connor had formulated in Panama in the 1920s were still shaping American military strategy 60 years later. In 1930, President Roosevelt offered Fox Connor the position of Army Chief of Staff. He declined. the historical record on why is ambiguous in ways that are themselves revealing. Eisenhower thought Connor hated staff jobs and would have resigned before taking the post. Other accounts suggest he was more deeply affected by the decision than he let on, that the offer had landed harder than his refusal suggested, and that something about being asked and then stepping back from it was not as uncomplicated as either version implies. What is clear is that Fox Connor had spent his career being the person behind the people who received the credit. He had declined the highest position in the Army. He had built his most significant work in a jungle posting in Central America, largely invisible, with a junior officer almost no one else was paying attention to. He retired in 1938. He was 64 years old. Poor health had been building for years. The Army's institutional culture had never developed a formal mechanism for recognizing what he had actually done. And on September 1st, 1939, exactly 1 year and 1 day after his retirement, Germany invaded Poland. The war Fox Connor had predicted for 20 years, the war he had spent 2 decades building other men to fight, had arrived. He was not able to fight in it. He followed the campaigns from outside, reading newspapers and listening to radio broadcasts, understanding what was happening at a level almost no civilian observer could, because he had built the conceptual frameworks being applied in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany by men whose thinking he had shaped. He saw Eisenhower manage the Allied coalition using principles that Connor had first articulated in Panama. He watched Marshall deploy an understanding of officer quality and human judgment that their wartime working relationship had partly constructed. He received no credit for any of it. He watched his student, the near court-martialed major he had pulled from a dead-end posting in 1922, become the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe, plan the largest amphibious invasion in history, and accept Germany's unconditional surrender. He watched all of it from outside. In the photographs from Normandy, Fox Connor is not there. In the newsreels from the liberation of Paris, he is not there. In the ceremony where Germany surrendered, he is not there. He is not in a single documentary about the war he had predicted, the war he had prepared others to fight, the war his students had won. Fox Connor died on October 13th, 1951, in New York. He was 77 years old. By then, the war had been over for 6 years. His students had won it. The principles he had transmitted in Panama were already built into NATO's foundational structure. The men he had shaped were holding commands that stretched from Washington to Tokyo to the Rhine. His name appeared in almost none of the books that told that story. Eisenhower wrote about him honestly, calling him the one more or less invisible figure to whom I owe an incalculable debt. But Eisenhower's memoirs were about Eisenhower, and Connor remained what he had always been, a footnote, a paragraph, a sentence in someone else's story. The journalist who had asked Eisenhower the question in 1964 had probably never heard of Fox Connor before the interview started, probably hadn't thought much about him after it ended. Only Eisenhower knew what was actually there, what those 3 years in Panama had given him, what the nightly reading sessions had built, what it had meant, in 1944, in the planning rooms and command conferences and coalition crises of the most complicated military operation in American history, to have already spent 3 years learning how to think about exactly these problems, in a jungle, with a general who had predicted all of it and made sure someone would be ready. Normandy, the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, the race to the Elbe, Germany's surrender. Every victory Americans remember from the Second World War. Every one of them carried the fingerprints of a man who wasn't there to witness a single one.